We have with us today Samuel Noah Kramer, Clark Research Professor Emeritus of Assyriology at the University of Pennsylvania.
There are interviews they never wanted released. Samuel Noah Kramer, the single greatest authority on humanity's first civilization, sat down in front of a camera at 91 years old, weeks from death, and said 7 words that should have shattered every ancient history textbook on the planet. We have gotten this wrong. All of it. This wasn't some fringe theorist. This was the man.
We know now that Sumerian literature consists primarily of epics, proverbs, fables, and essays of various sorts, especially essays in relation to education. That tells us something about the old education.
For over 50 years, every translation, every museum exhibit, every college lecture about ancient Sumer traced back to him. His word was treated as sacred. His interpretations shaped how the entire modern world understood where civilization began.
These disputations and these essays tell you a great deal. However, we must exonerate Mr. Seville a little bit. They are very difficult to translate.
And in his final days, trembling hands gripping the same clay tablets that built his legacy, he tried to tear the whole thing down. His colleagues buried the interviews. The academic establishment moved on like it never happened. But the transcripts survived, and what Kramer confessed before he died doesn't just raise questions about Sumer, it exposes a possibility about human consciousness itself that nobody in mainstream academia is willing to touch. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. The man who owned Sumer.
For many years, Professor Kramer has written on Sumerian civilization, more than 150 articles on Sumerian civilization, and his most recent book is History Begins at Sumer.
Here's what you need to understand. For 50 years, Samuel Noah Kramer didn't just study Sumer. He was Sumer, at least as far as the modern world was concerned. Every textbook, his translations, every museum exhibit explaining those wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay, his interpretations, every documentary, every academic paper, every university lecture about where human civilization actually began. All of it traced back to one basement at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and to one man sitting inside it, alone, for decades. He deciphered thousands of tablets, literally thousands. And get this, when he started in the 1920s, Sumerian was a dead language with no instruction manual, no native speakers, no dictionaries, no Rosetta Stone sitting conveniently in a display case waiting to hand. Over the answers, he taught himself, word by word, pattern by pattern, comparing fragments, testing guesses, building an entire linguistic framework over 6 decades of solitary, obsessive work that no other living scholar could replicate.
The Lord Kuliana met me. The Lord put his hand into my hand. Dumuzi embraced me.
His 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, introduced millions to a civilization most had never heard of. The first recorded love song, the first legal code, the first written literature. Kramer didn't just translate their words. He resurrected an entire world that had been silent for 4,000 years. Every time archaeologists dug up new tablets anywhere on Earth, they shipped them to Kramer, not to a department, not to a committee, to him. He was the final word, the single living bridge between the modern world and humanity's deepest past. If Kramer said a tablet meant something, that's what it meant. End of discussion. So picture this, a man at the absolute peak of his field, honorary degrees from universities worldwide, his translations, embedded in curricula across every continent, his framework accepted as fact by an entire academic discipline, and then he started finding cracks, small ones at first, hidden in places nobody thought to look. But here's the deal. Those cracks would eventually split the whole foundation wide open. The footnotes. Nobody read it, started so quietly that almost nobody noticed. Go back to Kramer's academic papers from the 1960s and 70s. Not the abstracts, not the conclusions, the footnotes. Buried at the bottom of pages nobody reads twice. You'd find something strange, little asides, almost whispered. A particular word has no exact English equivalent. This concept is difficult to render in modern terms. Certain passages have meaning that remains obscure. Normal scholarly caution, right? Every translator acknowledges difficulties, nothing to worry about. Except the footnotes kept multiplying, year after year, and they stopped reading like professional disclaimers. They started reading like a man arguing with himself in the margins of his own work, questioning, second-guessing, circling back to problems he couldn't solve. By the 1980s, Kramer published a line in an academic journal that should have detonated across every ancient history department in the world. The more I study these texts, the less certain I become about their true meaning. Read that again. The world's foremost expert on humanity's oldest written language, saying he's less certain, not more, after 60 years of work. His colleagues dismissed it. "Sam's losing it," they whispered in faculty meetings. Too long in that basement, an aging scholar going soft. Happens to the best of them. They were wrong. Kramer wasn't going soft. He was seeing clearly for the first time. He'd stumbled onto something about Sumerian thought that violated every assumption he'd built his career on.
We know now that Sumerian literature consists primarily of epics, myths, hymns, laments, and so-called wisdom literature, which consists of proverbs.
The Sumerian language had no word that clearly meant religion, as we understand it. None. No distinction. Between natural and supernatural. No concept of miracle. And the reason was devastating, because they had no baseline of normal for miracles to violate. The Sumerians didn't separate sacred from secular, didn't separate spiritual from material. Those categories we treat as obvious, as fundamental, they didn't exist, not for these people. And that word we've been translating as God for 100 years, it meant something closer to great power or cosmic principle. It wasn't clear the Sumerians worshipped these entities the way we assume. It wasn't even clear they thought of them as beings in any sense we'd recognize. In a 1987 interview, Kramer said something that should have made international headlines. "When I translate a Sumerian text about the creation of the world, I use English words like creation and world. But I am no longer convinced the Sumerians had anything like our concept of creation, or our concept of world. I think they might have been describing something completely different." He paused. The interviewer later said his eyes looked haunted. "And I have spent 50 years putting their thoughts into categories they would not have recognized." If this is already rewriting everything you thought you knew about ancient history, hit subscribe, because what Kramer found next makes this look like a warm-up. The real crisis wasn't the footnotes. It wasn't the growing doubt. It was a single tablet, one he'd translated 40 years earlier, one that was about to break everything. The tablet that broke him. This is where it gets insane. The tablet came from Nippur, one of Sumer's most ancient cities, dated to around 2100 BCE. It had been sitting in the Penn Museum collection for decades, translated, published, filed away. Case closed. Kramer's 1949 translation described a dialogue between a human and a divine figure discussing the nature of knowledge and the origin of civilization. In his version, the divine figure explains how the gods granted civilization to humanity, a gift from above to the creatures below. It fit the established narrative perfectly. Gods giving knowledge to primitive humans. Same story the Egyptians told, same story the Greeks told, same story every ancient culture seemed to echo. Case closed, translation published, career cemented. Everyone moved on. Everyone except Kramer. That tablet haunted him. 40 years of something feeling wrong that he couldn't name. A whisper at the edge of his understanding that got louder the more he tried to ignore it. He told a colleague in the late 1970s that he sometimes dreamed about it.
It includes, in addition to epics and myths, and those are the two aspects of the Sumerian literary genre that I particularly specialized on.
The symbols rearranging themselves in his sleep into messages he could almost read, but could never hold on to once he woke up. In 1988, 91 years old, Kramer returned to it one final time. His assistant later described the scene. 3 hours, just sitting there, turning the clay over in his spotted hands, dust catching in his wrinkles, trying to forget his own. Translation, trying to see what the original Sumerian actually said instead of what he'd assumed it must say. Then something happened. The color drained from his face. 3 full minutes of absolute silence. His assistant asked if he needed a doctor. Kramer looked up, voice barely a whisper. "I've had it wrong, all of it, for 40 years. Here's the catch. The word he'd translated as gift, it could also mean awakening or remembering. The word he'd translated as human, it could mean sleeping one or unaware one. And the word he'd translated as God, it could mean fully conscious one or aware power. Stay with me here. You see where this is going. Reread with these alternative meanings. The tablet wasn't saying the gods gave civilization to primitive humans. It was saying civilization emerged when humans awakened to capacities they already possessed. That what we call gods might have been the Sumerian way of describing states of consciousness, modes of awareness that we no longer access or even recognize. This wasn't a minor reinterpretation. This turned the entire text inside out. Kramer showed it to colleagues. Dr. William Hallow at Yale, a man who'd spent 40 years of his own career building directly on Kramer's original translations, citing them in book after book, reportedly went pale when he read the new interpretation. His hands were shaking. "Sam, this would invalidate everything. My books, my students' dissertations, entire departments built on your framework, all of it." Dr. Miguel Civil at the University of Chicago, one of the only other scholars alive who could independently verify Kramer's Sumerian readings, was blunter. "You need to rest, Sam. This isn't scholarship anymore. This is a breakdown." But Kramer couldn't unsee it. That's the thing about seeing something true. You can't unfind it. You can't stuff it back into the box. He went back through every major translation he'd ever published. The work that built his reputation. The work that built everyone else's reputation. Text after text after text. And in every single one, the same problem. He'd imposed modern categories onto Sumerian thought. He'd assumed what the text must mean based on what made sense to a 20th century academic mind. 50 years, thousands of tablets. An entire civilization's voice filtered through the wrong lens. And he was the one who built the lens. And that wasn't even the worst part. The consciousness collapse.
So we have a good many lamentations, a great many hymns, hundreds of them. I have not particularly concentrated on hymns. I have translated several, but other scholars have done and are doing a good deal of work.
In those final interviews, the ones they tried to bury, Kramer attempted something nobody expected. He tried to explain what the Sumerians actually were, not what they built, not what they wrote, what they were, at the level of consciousness itself. And here's what he admitted first. He couldn't fully do it, because he was trapped in the same modern consciousness that created the problem. He was a fish trying to describe water from inside the tank. But he tried, piece by piece, evidence by evidence, and each piece lands like a separate bomb. First, their mathematics. The Sumerians used base 60. We use base 10 because we have 10 fingers. Obvious, intuitive, simple. But 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Mathematically elegant in ways base, 10 can't touch. We still use it, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Standard explanation? Clever people noticed useful properties and ran with them. Kramer's question was different. What if base 60 wasn't a choice? What if it reflected how they actually perceived numerical relationships? What if their consciousness structured quantity in a way ours physically cannot? Let that sit for a second. Next, their astronomy. The Sumerians tracked planetary movements with precision that modern astronomers have confirmed using computer simulations. Star charts accurate for millennia. Knowledge about planetary cycles that Europeans didn't rediscover until the Renaissance, thousands of years later. They mapped Venus with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible with the tools they supposedly had. They cataloged celestial movements that required either centuries of meticulous record-keeping passed down without error, or something else entirely. Standard explanation? Patient observation over many generations. Kramer's question? What if they weren't just observing? What if they were perceiving these patterns directly, through a mode of awareness we've lost? That one should bother you. Then, the technology. And this is where it gets really uncomfortable. irrigation systems that transformed inhospitable marshland into one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. Massive ziggurats aligned with celestial precision we still can't fully explain. Metallurgy requiring exact temperature control. Urban planning with drainage systems, standardized streets, public buildings that rival modern city design. All of it appearing around 4,500 BCE. No gradual development, no evolutionary chain of simpler versions leading up to mastery.
There are still hundreds to be translated of these hymns.
I see.
And then there are the famous wisdom texts.
Just, suddenly, sophistication. And get this, those tablets describing God's granting knowledge to humanity, what if they weren't religious myths at all? What if they were records of sudden cognitive shifts that made certain technologies immediately obvious to minds wired fundamentally differently than ours? Nobody wanted to touch that one. And then, the collapse itself. This is the part that kept Kramer awake at night. Sumer fell around 2000 BCE. Conquered, cities abandoned, people scattered across the ancient world. Standard story. Civilizations rise and fall. Sumer was just the first to go through the cycle. Normal stuff, nothing to see here. But Kramer noticed something in the tablets from Sumer's final centuries that nobody else had flagged. Something chilling. The later texts weren't just different in content. They were different in the quality of thought they represented. More concrete, more practical, less cosmic, less aware. It was like watching a civilization lose resolution, like a photograph slowly going out of focus over generations. Whatever mode of consciousness made early Sumer possible was fading, and the later Sumerians were writing like people who could no longer understand their own ancestors' words. They had the tablets. They could read the symbols. But the meaning behind the meaning was gone. That pattern was everywhere once you started looking. The Sumerian king list drove it home hardest. Early kings with impossible reigns. 28,800 years. 36,000 years. Numbers so absurd that every modern historian dismisses them as mythology or scribal exaggeration. Later, kings with normal lifespans. 20 years, 30 years. Standard interpretation. Myth giving way to history. Early scribes embellishing, later scribes getting more accurate. Simple, clean, case closed. Kramer saw something else entirely. He saw a record of cognitive shift. What earlier Sumerians experienced as rain, whatever that word truly pointed to in their consciousness, became something smaller over time, more limited, more bounded, more like what later civilizations understood as kingship. The word survived across centuries. Whatever reality it originally described did not. In his final recorded interview, weeks before his death, Kramer's voice was barely audible. I think Sumer's collapse wasn't a political event. It was a consciousness event. Something about how they experienced reality changed, and once it changed, they couldn't maintain their civilization. They couldn't even understand what they had built, or why. He leaned toward the camera, eyes wet. We are their descendants, living in the aftermath of that change, trying to read their texts but unable to understand them, because we are on the other side of the divide. What died with him? Samuel Noah Kramer died on November 26, 1990, 93 years. Bold, alone with his doubts. His obituary in the New York Times praised a giant of the field. It mentioned his translations, his books, his honorary degrees, his decades of tireless achievement. Called him the father of Sumerian studies. Celebrated a life spent recovering humanity's oldest words from silence.
Angalta kigalshe gestugani nango, which means from the grade above to the grade below, she set her mind, right?
Not a single line about his final interviews. Not a word about the crisis that consumed his last years. Not one acknowledgement that the man who single-handedly built the modern world's understanding of its oldest civilization had spent his dying days trying to demolish the whole thing. The interviews were quietly shelved, the transcripts filed in archives where maybe, some graduate student might stumble across them decades later. No press conferences, no emergency academic symposiums, no soul-searching editorials. Just silence. Deliberate, professional, institutional silence. His earlier translations stayed in every textbook, unchanged, His original framework remained, the foundation of an entire academic discipline. Professors who'd built careers on his work had zero incentive to question it. Tenure committees don't reward people who blow up their own foundations. Publishing houses don't reprint books with forewords that read, "Everything you're about to read may be fundamentally wrong." The narrative Kramer created and then begged the world to abandon stayed intact, untouched, unchallengeable. But here's the catch. His doubts didn't die with him. A small number of researchers in consciousness studies and cognitive anthropology quietly picked up where he left off. Working in the margins, publishing in journals nobody in mainstream Assyriology reads. Some started retranslating Sumerian texts with his late insights in mind, and the results are startling. Religious myths start reading like descriptions of consciousness states. King lists become records of different modes of existence. Creation stories become accounts of cognitive awakening, not divine intervention. The texts start making a different kind of sense, a deeper sense, one that Kramer glimpsed but never lived long enough to fully articulate. None of it has reached mainstream academia. Too many careers, too many reputations, too many cards stacked on a framework nobody wants to pull. But the deeper resistance isn't academic politics. It's something worse, something personal, something that touches every person alive today. If Kramer was right, if the Sumerians possess something we've lost, then our entire story about ourselves is wrong. We think we're the pinnacle, the summit of human achievement, technology the ancients couldn't dream of, science, rationality, progress stacked on progress stretching endlessly forward. But what if the Sumerians weren't primitive? What if they had capacities we can't even conceptualize? What if what we call progress means gaining some abilities while quietly losing others we don't even know existed? What if the price of everything we've built was something immeasurable, a way of experiencing reality that made civilization possible in the first place? The tablets are still there, in museums, in basement archives gathering the same dust that clung to Kramer's hands for 60 years. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, each one a voice from 5 millennia ago, trying to tell us something. And we stand over them with our modern minds, our modern categories, our modern certainty. And we cannot hear what they are saying. We read the words, we miss the meaning, we translate the language, we fail to translate the consciousness behind it. "Before I die, please listen," he said. "We have gotten this wrong, not the details, the whole framework." The man who knew Sumer better than anyone alive died believing we are reading ancient words and missing ancient meaning. Nobody listened then. The question is whether you're listening now. So, here's my question. Do you think we've lost something our ancestors had, or was Kramer simply wrong? Drop your theory in the comments. If you want more hidden history the establishment doesn't want you to see, smash that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.